The Theatre of the Absurd. The plays of Samuel Beckett, Arthur Adamov, and Eugène Ionesco have been performed with astonishing success in France, Germany, Scandinavia, and the English-speaking countries. This reception is all the more puzzling when one considers that the audiences concerned were amused by and applauded these plays, fully aware that they could not understand what they meant or what their authors were driving at. At first sight, these plays do, indeed, confront their public with a bewildering experience, a veritable barrage of wildly irrational, often nonsensical goings-on that seem to go counter to all accepted standards of stage convention. In these plays, some of which are labeled anti-plays, neither the time nor the place of the action are ever clearly stated. At the beginning of Ionesco's The Bald Soprano, the clock strikes 17. The characters hardly have any individuality, and often even lack a name. Moreover, halfway through the action, they tend to change their nature completely. Pozzo and Lucky, in Beckett's Waiting for Godot, for example, appear as master and slave at one moment, only to return after a while with their respective positions mysteriously reversed. The laws of probability, as well as those of physics, are suspended when we meet young ladies with 2 or even 3 noses, Ionesco's Jacques, or The Submission. Or a corpse that has been hidden in the next room that suddenly begins to grow to monstrous size until a giant foot crashes through the door onto the stage, Ionesco's Amédée. As a result, it is often unclear whether the action is meant to represent a dream world of nightmares or real happenings. Within the same scene, the action may switch from the nightmarish poetry of high emotions to pure knockabout farce or cabaret. And above all, the dialogue tends to get out of hand, so that at times the words seem to go counter to the actions of the characters on the stage, to degenerate into lists of words and phrases from a dictionary or traveller's conversation book, or to get bogged down in endless repetitions like a phonograph record stuck in one groove. Only in this kind of demented world can strangers meet and discover, after a long and polite conversation and close cross-questioning, that, to their immense surprise, they must be man and wife, as they are living on the same street, in the same house, apartment, room, and bed, Ionesco's The Bald Soprano. Only here can the whole life of a group of characters revolve around the passionate discussion of the aesthetics and economics of pinball machines, Adamov's ping-pong. Above all, everything that happens seems to be beyond rational motivation, happening at random or through the demented caprice of an unaccountable idiot fate. Yet these wildly extravagant tragic farces and farcical tragedies, although they have suffered their share of protests and scandals, do arouse interest and are received with laughter and thoughtful respect. What is the explanation for this curious phenomenon? The most obvious, but perhaps too facile answer that suggests itself is that these plays are prime examples of pure theatre. They are living proof that the magic of the stage can persist even outside and divorced from any framework of conceptual rationality. They prove that exits and entrances, light and shadow, contrasts in costume, voice, gait, and behavior, pratfalls and embraces, all the manifold mechanical interactions of human puppets in groupings that suggest tension, conflict, or the relaxation of tensions, can arouse laughter or gloom and conjure up an atmosphere of poetry, even if devoid of logical motivation and unrelated to recognizable human characters, emotions, and objects. But this is only a partial explanation. While the element of pure theatre and abstract stagecraft is certainly at work in the plays concerned, they also have a much more substantial content and meaning. Not only do all these plays make sense, though perhaps not obvious or conventional sense, they also give expression to some of the basic issues and problems of our age in a uniquely efficient and meaningful manner, so that they meet some of the deepest needs and unexpressed yearnings of their audience. The 3 dramatists that have been grouped together here would probably most energetically deny that they form anything like a school or movement. Each of them, in fact, has his own roots and sources, his own very personal approach to both form and subject matter. Yet they also clearly have a good deal in common. This common denominator that characterizes their works might well be described as the element of the absurd. Et absurde, ce qui n'a pas de but. Absurd is that which has no purpose, or goal, or objective. The definition given by Ionesco in a note on Kafka certainly applies to the plays of Beckett and Ionesco as well as those of Arthur Adamov up to his latest play, Paolo Paoli, when he returned to a more traditional form of social drama. Each of these writers, however, has his own special type of absurdity. In Beckett, it is melancholic, colored by a feeling of futility born from the disillusionment of old age and chronic hopelessness. Adamov's is more active, aggressive, earthy, and tinged with social and political overtones, while Ionesco's absurdity has its own fantastic knockabout flavor of tragical clowning. But they all share the same deep sense of human isolation and of the irremediable character of the human condition. As Arthur Adamov put it in describing how he came to write his first play, La Parodie, 1947, I began to discover stage scenes in the most commonplace, everyday events. One day I saw a blind man begging. 2 girls went by without seeing him, singing, "I closed my eyes. It was marvelous." This gave me the idea of showing on stage, as crudely and as visibly as possible, the loneliness of man, the absence of communication among human beings. Looking back at his earliest effort, which he now regards as unsuccessful, Adamov defines his basic idea in it, and a number of subsequent plays, as the idea that the destinies of all human beings are of equal futility, that the refusal to live of the character called N, and the joyful acceptance of life by the employee both lead, by the same path, to inevitable failure, total destruction. It is the same futility and pointlessness of human effort, the same impossibility of human communication, which Ionesco expresses in ever new and ingenious variations. The 2 old people making conversation with the empty air and living in the expectation of an orator who is to pronounce profound truths about life, but turns out to be deaf and dumb. The chairs are as sardonically cruel a symbol of this fundamentally tragic view of human existence as Jacques or the submission, who stubbornly resists the concerted urgings of his entire family to subscribe to the most sacred principle of his clan, which, when his resistance finally yields to their entreaties, turns out to be the profound truth. "I love potatoes with bacon. J'adore les pommes de terre au lard." The theatre of the absurd shows the world as an incomprehensible place. The spectators see the happenings on the stage entirely from the outside, without ever understanding the full meaning of these strange patterns of events, as newly arrived visitors might watch life in a country of which they have not yet mastered the language. The confrontation of the audience with characters and happenings which they are not quite able to comprehend makes it impossible for them to share the aspirations and emotions depicted in the play. Brecht's famous Verfremdungseffekt, alienation effect, the inhibition of any identification between spectator and actor, which Brecht could never successfully achieve in his own highly rational theatre, really comes into its own in the theatre of the absurd. It is impossible to identify oneself with characters one does not understand, or whose motives remain a closed book, and so the distance between the public and the happenings on the stage can be maintained. Emotional identification with the characters is replaced by a puzzled, critical attention. For while the happenings on the stage are absurd, they yet remain recognizable as somehow related to real life with its absurdity, so that eventually the spectators are brought face to face with the irrational side of their existence. Thus the absurd and fantastic goings-on of the theatre of the absurd will, in the end, be found to reveal the irrationality of the human condition and the illusion of what we thought was its apparent logical structure. If the dialogue in these plays consists of meaningless clichés and the mechanical, circular repetition of stereotyped phrases, how many meaningless clichés and stereotyped phrases do we use in our day-to-day conversation? If the characters change their personality halfway through the action, how consistent and truly integrated are the people we meet in our real life? And if people in these plays appear as mere marionettes, helpless puppets without any will of their own, passively at the mercy of blind fate and meaningless circumstance, do we, in fact, in our over-organized world, still possess any genuine initiative or power to decide our destiny? The spectators of the theatre of the absurd are thus confronted with a grotesquely heightened picture of their own world, a world without faith, meaning, and genuine freedom of will. In this sense, the theatre of the absurd is the true theatre of our time. The theatre of most previous epochs reflected an accepted moral order, a world whose aims and objectives were clearly present to the minds of all its public, Whether it was the audience of the medieval mystery plays with their solidly accepted faith in the Christian world order, or the audience of the drama of Ibsen, Shaw, or Hauptmann with their unquestioned belief in evolution and progress. To such audiences, right and wrong were never in doubt, nor did they question the then accepted goals of human endeavor. Our own time, at least in the Western world, wholly lacks such a generally accepted and completely integrated world picture. The decline of religious faith, the destruction of the belief in automatic social and biological progress, the discovery of vast areas of irrational and unconscious forces within the human psyche, the loss of a sense of control over rational human development in an age of totalitarianism and weapons of mass destruction have all contributed to the erosion of the basis for a dramatic convention in which the action proceeds within a fixed and self-evident framework of generally accepted values. Faced with the vacuum left by the destruction of a universally accepted and unified set of beliefs, most serious playwrights have felt the need to fit their work into the frame of values and objectives expressed in one of the contemporary ideologies: Marxism, psychoanalysis, aestheticism, or nature worship. But these, in the eyes of a writer like Adamov, are nothing but superficial rationalizations which try to hide the depth of man's predicament, his loneliness and his anxiety. Or, as Ionesco puts it, "As far as I am concerned, I believe sincerely in the poverty of the poor. I deplore it. It is real. It can become a subject for the theatre. I also believe in the anxieties and serious troubles the rich may suffer from, but it is neither in the misery of the former, nor in the melancholia of the latter, that I, for one, find my dramatic subject matter. Theatre is for me the outward projection onto the stage of an inner world. It is in my dreams, in my anxieties, in my obscure desires, in my internal contradictions that I, for one, reserve for myself the right of finding my dramatic subject matter. As I am not alone in the world, as each of us, in the depth of his being, is at the same time part and parcel of all others, my dreams, my desires, my anxieties, my obsessions do not belong to me alone. They form part of an ancestral heritage, a very ancient storehouse, which is a portion of the common property of all mankind. It is this which, transcending their outward diversity, reunites all human beings and constitutes our profound common patrimony, the universal language. In other words, the commonly acceptable framework of beliefs and values of former epochs, which has now been shattered, is to be replaced by the community of dreams and desires of a collective unconscious. And, to quote Ionesco again, "The new dramatist is one who tries to link up with what is most ancient, new language and subject matter in a dramatic structure which aims at being clearer, more stripped of inessentials, and more purely theatrical. The rejection of traditionalism to rediscover tradition, a synthesis of knowledge and invention, of the real and imaginary, of the particular and the universal, or, as they say now, of the individual and the collective. By expressing my deepest obsessions, I express my deepest humanity. I become one with all others spontaneously, over and above all the barriers of caste and different psychologies. I express my solitude and become one with all other solitudes." What is the tradition with which the theatre of the absurd, at first sight the most revolutionary and radically new movement, is trying to link itself? It is, in fact, a very ancient and a very rich tradition, nourished from many and varied sources. The verbal exuberance and extravagant inventions of Rabelais, the age-old clowning of the Roman mimes and the Italian commedia dell'arte, the knockabout humor of circus clowns like Grock, the wild archetypal symbolism of English nonsense verse, the Baroque horror of Jacobean dramatists like Webster or Turner, the harsh, incisive, and often brutal tones of the German drama of Grabbe, Büchner, Kleist, and Wedekind, with its delirious language and grotesque inventiveness, and the Nordic paranoia of the dreams and persecution fantasies of Strindberg. All these streams, however, first came together and crystallized in the more direct ancestors of the present theatre of the absurd. Of these, undoubtedly the first and foremost is Alfred Jarry, 1873 to 1907, the creator of Ubu Roi, the first play which clearly belongs in the category of the theatre of the absurd. Ubu Roi, first performed in Paris on December 10th, 1896, is a Rabelaisian nonsense drama about the fantastic adventures of a fat, cowardly, and brutal figure, le Père Ubu, who makes himself king of Poland, fights a series of Falstaffian battles, and is finally routed. As if to challenge all accepted codes of propriety, and thus to open a new era of irreverence, the play opens with a defiant expletive, merde, which immediately provoked a scandal. This, of course, was what Jarry intended. Ubu, in its rollicking Rabelaisian parody of a Shakespearean history play, was meant to confront the Parisian bourgeois with a monstrous portrait of his own greed, selfishness, and philistinism. As the curtain went up, I wanted to confront the public with a theatre in which, as in the magic mirror of the fairy tales, the vicious man sees his reflection with bull's horns and the body of a dragon, the projections of his viciousness. But Ubu is more than a mere monstrous exaggeration of the selfishness and crude sensuality of the French bourgeois. He is at the same time the personification of the grossness of human nature, an enormous belly walking on two legs. That is why Jarry put him on the stage as a monstrous pot-bellied figure in a highly stylized costume and mask, a mythical, archetypal externalization of human instincts of the lowest kind. Thus, Ubu, the false king of Poland, pretended doctor of the pseudoscience of pataphysics, clearly anticipates one of the main characteristics of the theatre of the absurd, its tendency to externalize and project outwards what is happening in the deeper recesses of the mind. Examples of this tendency are the disembodied voices of monitors shouting commands at the hero of Adamov's La Grande et la Petite Manœuvre, which concretizes his neurotic compulsions, the mutilated trunks of the parents in Beckett's Endgame emerging from ashcans, the ashcans of the main character's subconscious to which he has banished his past and his conscience, or the proliferations of fungi that invade the married couple's apartment in Ionesco's Amédée and express the rottenness and decay of their relationship. All these psychological factors are not only projected outwards, they are also, as in Jarry's Ubu, grotesquely magnified and exaggerated. This scornful rejection of all subtleties is a reaction against the supposed finesse of the psychology of the naturalistic theatre, in which everything was to be inferred between the lines. The theatre of the absurd, from Jarry onwards, stands for explicitness as against implicit psychology, and in this resembles the highly explicit theatre of the expressionists, or the political theatre of Piscator or Brecht. To be larger and more real than life was also the aim of Guillaume Apollinaire, the great poet who was one of the seminal forces in the rise of Cubism and who had close personal and artistic links with Jarry. If Apollinaire labeled his play Les Mamelles de Tiresias a drame surréaliste, he did not intend that term, of which he was one of the earliest users, in the sense in which it later became famous. He wanted it to describe a play in which everything was larger than life, for he believed in an art which was to be modern, simple, rapid, with the shortcuts and enlargements that are needed to shock the spectator. In the prologue to Les Mamelles de Tiresias, a grotesque pamphlet purportedly advocating an immense rise in the French birth rate, Apollinaire makes the director of the company of actors who performed the play define his ideas. For the theatre should not be an imitation of reality. It is right that the dramatist should use all the illusions at his disposal. It is right that he should let crowds speak, or inanimate objects, if he so pleases, and that he no longer has to reckon with time and space. His universe is the play within which he is God the Creator, who disposes at will of sounds, gestures, movements, masses, colors, not merely in order to photograph what is called a slice of life, but to bring forth life itself and all its truth. Accordingly, in Les Mamelles de Tiresias, the whole population of Zanzibar, where the scene is laid, is represented by a single actor, and the heroine, Thérèse, changes herself into a man by letting her breasts float upwards like a pair of toy balloons. Although Les Mamelles de Tiresias was not a surrealist work in the strictest sense of the term, it clearly foreshadowed the ideas of the movement led by André Breton. Surrealism, in that narrower, technical sense, found little expression in the theatre. But Antonin Artaud, 1896 to 1948, another major influence in the development of the theatre of the absurd, did at one time belong to the Surrealist group, although his main activity in the theatre took place after he had broken with Breton. Artaud was one of the most unhappy men of genius of his age, an artist consumed by the most intense passions. Poet, actor, director, designer, immensely fertile and original in his inventions and ideas, yet always living on the borders of sanity and never able to realize his ambitions, plans, and projects. Artaud, who had been an actor in Charles Dulin's company at the Atelier, began his venture into the realm of experimental theatre in a series of productions characteristically sailing under the label Théâtre Alfred Jarry, 1927-29. But his theories of a new and revolutionary theatre only crystallized after he had been deeply stirred by a performance of Balinese dances at the Colonial Exhibition of 1931. He formulated his ideas in a series of impassioned manifestos later collected in the volume The Theatre and Its Double, 1938, which continues to exercise an important influence on the contemporary French theatre. Artaud named the theatre of his dreams Théâtre de la Cruauté, a theatre of cruelty, which, he said, means a theatre difficult and cruel above all for myself. Everything that is really active is cruelty. It is around this idea of action carried to the extreme that the theatre must renew itself. Here, too, the idea of action, larger and more real than life, is the dominant theme. Every performance will contain a physical and objective element that will be felt by all. Cries, wails, apparitions, surprises, coups de théâtre of all kinds, the magical beauty of costumes inspired by the model of certain rituals. The language of the drama must also undergo a change. It is not a matter of suppressing articulate speech, but of giving to the words something like the importance they have in dreams. In Artaud's new theatre, not only the obverse side of man will appear, but also the reverse side of the coin. The reality of imagination and of dreams will here be seen on an equal footing with everyday life. Artaud's only attempt at putting these theories to the test on the stage took place on May 6, 1935, at the Folies Wagram. Artaud had made his own adaptation, after Shelley and Stendhal, of the story of the Cenci, that somber Renaissance story of incest and patricide. It was in many ways a beautiful and memorable performance, but full of imperfections and a financial disaster which marked the beginning of Artaud's eventual descent into despair, insanity, and abject poverty. Jean-Louis Barrault had some small part in this venture, and Roger Blin, the actor and director who later played an important part in bringing Adamov, Beckett, and Ionesco to the stage, appeared in the small role of one of the hired assassins. Jean-Louis Barrault, one of the most creative figures in the theatre of our time, was in turn responsible for another venture which played an important part in the development of the theatre of the absurd. He staged André Gide's adaptation of Franz Kafka's novel The Trial in 1947 and played the part of the hero K himself. Undoubtedly, this performance, which brought the dream world of Kafka to a triumphant unfolding on the stage and demonstrated the effectiveness of this particular brand of fantasy in practical theatrical terms, exercised a profound influence on the practitioners of the new movement. From here, too, they saw the externalization of mental processes, the acting out of nightmarish dreams by schematized figures in a world of torment and absurdity. The dream element in the theatre of the absurd can also be traced, in the case of Adamov, to Strindberg, acknowledged by him as his inspiration at the time when he began to think of writing for the theatre. This is the Strindberg of the Ghost Sonata, the Dream Play, and of To Damascus. Adamov is the author of an excellent brief monograph on Strindberg. But if Jarry, Artaud, Kafka, and Strindberg can be regarded as the decisive influences in the development of the theatre of the absurd, there is another giant of European literature that must not be omitted from the list, James Joyce, for whom Beckett at one time is supposed to have acted as helper and secretary. Not only is the Nighttown episode of Ulysses one of the earliest examples of the theatre of the absurd, with its exuberant mingling of the real and the nightmarish, its wild fantasies and externalizations of subconscious yearnings and fears, But Joyce's experimentation with language, his attempt to smash the limitations of conventional vocabulary and syntax, has probably exercised an even more powerful impact on all the writers concerned. It is in its attitude to language that the theatre of the absurd is most revolutionary. It deliberately attempts to renew the language of drama and to expose the barrenness of conventional stage dialogue. Ionesco once described how he came to write his first play. He had decided to take English lessons and began to study at the Berlitz School. When he read and repeated the sentences in his phrasebook, those petrified corpses of once living speech, he was suddenly overcome by their tragic quality. From them, he composed his first play, The Bald Soprano. The absurdity of its dialogue and its fantastic quality springs directly from its basic ordinariness. It exposes the emptiness of stereotyped language. What is sometimes labeled the absurd, Ionesco says, is only the denunciation of the ridiculous nature of a language which is empty of substance, made up of clichés and slogans. Such a language has atrophied. It has ceased to be the expression of anything alive or vital, and has been degraded into a mere conventional token of human intercourse, a mask for genuine meaning and emotion. This is why so often in the theatre of the absurd the dialogue becomes divorced from the real happenings in the play, and is even put into direct contradiction with the action. The professor and pupil in Ionesco's The Lesson seem to be going through a repetition of conventional schoolbook phrases, but behind this smokescreen of language, the real action of the play pursues an entirely different course, with the professor, vampire-like, draining the vitality from the young girl up to the final moment when he plunges his knife into her body. In Beckett's Waiting for Godot, Lucky's much vaunted philosophical wisdom is revealed to be a flood of completely meaningless gibberish that vaguely resembles the language of philosophical argument. And in Adamov's remarkable play Ping Pong, a good deal of the dramatic power lies in the contrapuntal contrast between the triviality of the theme, the improvement of pinball machines, and the almost religious fervor with which it is discussed. Here, in order to bring out the full meaning of the play, the actors have to act against the dialogue rather than with it. The fervor of the delivery must stand in a dialectical contrast to the pointlessness of the meaning of the lines. In the same way, the author implies that most of the fervent and passionate discussion of real life, of political controversy, to give but one example, also turns around empty and meaningless clichés. Or, as Ionesco says in an essay on Antonin Artaud, as our knowledge becomes increasingly divorced from real life, our culture no longer contains ourselves, or only contains an insignificant part of ourselves, and forms a social context in which we are not integrated. The problem thus becomes that of again reconciling our culture with our life by making our culture a living culture once more. But to achieve this end, we shall first have to kill the respect for that which is written. It becomes necessary to break up our language so that it may become possible to put it together again and to re-establish contact with the absolute, or, as I should prefer to call it, with multiple reality. This quest for the multiple reality of the world, which is real because it exists on many planes simultaneously, and is more than a mere unidirectional abstraction, is not only in itself a search for a re-established poetical reality, poetry in its essence expressing reality in its ambiguity and multidimensional depth, it is also in close accord with important movements of our age in what appear to be entirely different fields, psychology and philosophy. The dissolution, devaluation, and relativization of language is, after all, also the theme of much of present-day depth psychology, which has shown what in former times was regarded as a rational expression of logically arrived-at conclusions to be the mere rationalization of subconscious emotional impulses. Not everything we say means what we intend it to mean, and likewise, in present-day logical positivism, a large proportion of all statements is regarded as devoid of conceptual meaning and merely emotive. A philosopher like Ludwig Wittgenstein, in his later phases, even tried to break through what he regarded as the opacity, the misleading nature of language and grammar. For if all our thinking is in terms of language, and language obeys what, after all, are the arbitrary conventions of grammar, we must strive to penetrate to the real content of thought that is masked by grammatical rules and conventions. Here, too, then, is a matter of getting behind the surface of linguistic clichés and of finding reality through the breakup of language. In the theatre of the absurd, therefore, the real content of the play lies in the action. Language may be discarded altogether, as in Beckett's Act Without Words or in Ionesco's The New Tenant, in which the whole sense of the play is contained in the incessant arrival of more and more furniture, so that the occupant of the room is, in the end, literally drowned in it. Here the movement of objects alone carries the dramatic action. The language has become purely incidental, less important than the contribution of the property department. In this, the theatre of the absurd also reveals its anti-literary character, its endeavour to link up with the pre-literary strata of stage history, the circus, the performances of itinerant jugglers and mountebanks, the music hall, fairground barkers, acrobats, and also the robust world of the silent film. Ionesco, in particular, clearly owes a great deal to Chaplin, Buster Keaton, the Keystone Cops, Laurel and Hardy, and the Marx brothers. And it is surely significant that so much of successful popular entertainment in our age shows affinities with the subject matter and preoccupation of the avant-garde theatre of the absurd. A sophisticated, but nevertheless highly popular film comedian like Jacques uses dialogue merely as a barely comprehensible babble of noises, and also dwells on the loneliness of man in our age, the horror of over-mechanization and over-organization gone mad. Danny Kaye excels in streams of gibberish closely akin to Lucky's oration in Waiting for Godot. The brilliant and greatly liked team of British radio and occasionally television comedians, the Goons, have a sense of the absurd that resembles Kafka's or Ionesco's, and a team of grotesque singers like Les Frères Jacques seems more closely in line with the theatre of the absurd than with the conventional cabaret. Yet the defiant rejection of language as the main vehicle of the dramatic action, the onslaught on conventional logic and unilinear conceptual thinking in the theatre of the absurd, is by no means equivalent to a total rejection of all meaning. On the contrary, it constitutes an earnest endeavour to penetrate to deeper layers of meaning and to give a truer, because more complex, picture of reality, in avoiding the simplification which results from leaving out all the undertones, overtones, and inherent absurdities and contradictions of any human situation. In the conventional drama, every word means what it says, the situations are clear-cut, and at the end all conflicts are tidily resolved. But reality, as Ionesco points out in the passage we have quoted, is never like that. It is multiple, complex, many-dimensional, and exists on a number of different levels at one and the same time. Language is far too straightforward an instrument to express all this by itself. Reality can only be conveyed by being acted out in all its complexity. Hence, it is the theatre, which is multidimensional and more than merely language or literature, which is the only instrument to express the bewildering complexity of the human condition. The human condition being what it is, with man small, helpless, insecure, and unable ever to fathom the world in all its hopelessness, death, and absurdity, the theatre has to confront him with the bitter truth that most human endeavour is irrational and senseless, the communication between human beings is well nigh impossible, and that the world will forever remain an impenetrable mystery. At the same time, the recognition of all these bitter truths will have a liberating effect. If we realize the basic absurdity of most of our objectives, we are freed from being obsessed with them, and this release expresses itself in laughter. Moreover, while the world is being shown as complex, harsh, and absurd, and as difficult to interpret as reality itself, the audience is yet spurred on to attempt their own interpretation, to wonder what it is all about. In that sense, they are being invited to school their critical faculties, to train themselves in adjusting to reality. As the world is being represented as highly complex and devoid of a clear-cut purpose or design, there will always be an infinite number of possible interpretations. As Apollinaire points out in his preface to Les Mamelles de Tiresias, none of the symbols in my play is very clear, but one is at liberty to see in it all the symbols one desires, and to find in it 1,000 senses, as in the Sibylline oracles. Thus, it may be that the pinball machines in Adamov's ping-pong and the ideology which is developed around them stand for the futility of political or religious ideologies that are pursued with equal fervor and equal futility in the final result. Others have interpreted the play as a parable on the greed and sordidness of the profit motive. Others again may give it quite different meanings. The mysterious transformation of human beings into rhinos in Ionesco's latest play, The Rhinoceros, was felt by the audience of its world premiere at Düsseldorf, November 6, 1959, to depict the transformation of human beings into Nazis. It is known that Ionesco himself intended the play to express his feelings at the time when more and more of his friends in Romania joined the fascist Iron Guard and, in effect, left the ranks of thin-skinned humans to turn themselves into moral pachyderms. But to spectators less intimately aware of the moral climate of such a situation than the German audience, other interpretations might impose themselves. If the hero, Berenger, is at the end left alone as the only human being in his native town, now entirely inhabited by rhinos, they might regard this as a poetic symbol of the gradual isolation of man growing old and imprisoned in the straitjacket of his own habits and memories. Does Gide, so fervently and vainly awaited by Vladimir and Estragon, stand for God? Or does he merely represent the ever-elusive tomorrow, man's hope that one day something will happen that will render his existence meaningful? The force and poetic power of the play lie precisely in the impossibility of ever reaching a conclusive answer to this question. Here we touch the essential point of difference between the conventional theatre and the theatre of the absurd. The former, based as it is on a known framework of accepted values and a rational view of life, always starts out by indicating a fixed objective towards which the action will be moving, or by posing a definite problem to which it will supply an answer. Will Hamlet revenge the murder of his father? Will Iago succeed in destroying Othello? Will Nora leave her husband? In the conventional theatre, the action always proceeds towards a definable end. The spectators do not know whether that end will be reached and how it will be reached. Hence, they are in suspense, eager to find out what will happen. In the theatre of the absurd, on the other hand, the action does not proceed in the manner of a logical syllogism. It does not go from A to B, but travels from an unknown premise X towards an unknowable conclusion Y. The spectators, not knowing what their author is driving at, cannot be in suspense as to how or whether an expected objective is going to be reached. They are not, therefore, so much in suspense as to what is going to happen next, although the most unexpected and unpredictable things do happen, as they are in suspense about what the next event to take place will add to their understanding of what is happening. The action supplies an increasing number of contradictory and bewildering clues on a number of different levels, but the final question is never wholly answered. Thus, instead of being in suspense as to what will happen next, the spectators are, in the theatre of the absurd, put into suspense as to what the play may mean. This suspense continues even after the curtain has come down. Here again, the theatre of the absurd fulfills Brecht's postulate of a critical, detached audience who will have to sharpen their wits on the play and be stimulated by it to think for themselves, far more effectively than Brecht's own theatre. Not only are the members of the audience unable to identify with the characters, they are compelled to puzzle out the meaning of what they have seen. Each of them will probably find his own personal meaning, which will differ from the solution found by most others. But he will have been forced to make a mental effort and to evaluate an experience he has undergone. In this sense, the theatre of the absurd is the most demanding, the most intellectual theatre. It may be riotously funny, wildly exaggerated and oversimplified, vulgar and garish, but it will always confront the spectator with a genuine intellectual problem, a philosophical paradox, which he will try to solve even if he knows that it is most probably insoluble. In this respect, the theatre of the absurd links up with an older tradition which has almost completely disappeared from Western culture, the tradition of allegory and the symbolical representation of abstract concepts personified by characters whose costumes and accoutrements subtly suggested whether they represented time, chastity, winter, fortune, the world, etc. This is the tradition which stretches from the Italian trionfo of the Renaissance to the English masque, the elaborate allegorical constructions of the Spanish auto sacramental, down to Goethe's allegorical processions and masques written for the court of Weimar at the turn of the 18th century. Although the living riddles the characters represented in these entertainments were by no means difficult to solve, as everyone knew that a character with a scythe and an hourglass represented time, and although the characters soon revealed their identity and explained their attributes, there was an element of intellectual challenge which stimulated the audience in the moments between the appearance of the riddle and its solution, and which provided them with the pleasure of having solved a puzzle. And what is more, in the elaborate allegorical dramas like Calderon's El Gran Teatro del Mundo, The subtle interplay of allegorical characters itself presented the audience with a great deal to think out for themselves. They had, as it were, to translate the abstractly presented action into terms of their everyday experience. They could ponder on the deeper meaning of such facts as death having taken the characters representing riches or poverty in a dance of death equally quickly and equally harshly, or that Mammon had deserted his master Everyman in the hour of death. The dramatic riddles of our time present no such clear-cut solutions. All they can show is that while the solutions have evaporated, the riddle of our existence remains complex, unfathomable, and paradoxical.